to introduce you all at the beginning. Is that all right? And then you can give the title of your paper and go into it one at a time. Does that sound good? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second day of our CACE conference presentations. My name is Noelle Morrissette. I am the Director of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at UNC Greensboro. And I must admit selfishly that I'm really enjoying this conference. There are so many good dialogues taking place across these 2 days. And I hope that our attendees will participate actively in this panel and also continue attending panels throughout the afternoon into the evening. So our panel this afternoon is called Black Speculation, Voices, Worlds, and Futures. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our 3 panelists. We have Robyn Luney, who is a graduate student in English here at UNC Greensboro. Robyn received her bachelor's and master's degrees from North Carolina State University in creative writing and world literature, and she taught at St. Augustine's University in Raleigh for 3 years before joining the English doctoral program at UNCG. She is currently working on her dissertation, which explores diasporic Afrofuturism and African futurism. We have Rejani King, who is an undergraduate student and a McNair Research Scholar at UNC Greensboro, majoring in women's, gender, and sexuality studies. Her area of interest is bridging speculative fiction and voice with Black women writers and taking on identity, surrogacy, and Black feminist theory, specifically stories theorizing the experiences of Black people, Black futures, and time. And finally, we have Paul Piedkowski, who is a PhD candidate in the English department at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. His area of specialization is post-1900 American literature. Paul is interested in African American studies, post-colonialism, science fiction, semiotics, and postmodern theory. More specifically, his research is focused on the work being done through recent speculative critical apparatuses to produce substantial cultural shifts within dominant modes of planetary thinking and action. And so we'll start with Robyn and move on from there. Don't forget to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you for that awesome introduction. And it was great to hear about everybody's presentations. I'm going to begin with a few slides and then read a bit from my paper. All right. Sorry, there's a little bar blocking what I need to hit.
Robyn, you're muted again.
There it is. My paper's title is Modern Flesh and Rearticulated Identity in Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber. Oh, it doesn't want to let me touch. I'm just going to do it from here. Nalo Hopkinson's Afrofuturism in Midnight Robber, I found demonstrates the potential for Afrofuturism to function as a proleptic thought experiment for Black feminist theory. So we study all these theories, but how do they apply as we envision the future? And so I find that the genre of Afrofuturism is really helpful in envisioning some of the futures to help us envision the future through Black feminist theory and also decolonial theory. And the genre of Afrofuturism sits at the intersection of science, technology, futurity, liberation, race, ethnicity, and relationality. So it has all this sort of cross-meshing and blending that gives it a really sort of fruitful place to explore the future in relation to Black feminist theory. So in relation to Midnight Robber, I explore how the text envisions Hortense Spiller's and C. Riley Snorton's theories of the flesh and trans embodiments. So Spiller's theory of the flesh illustrates how Western descriptions of gender are not applicable to the captive body, and she locates the site of the Middle Passage as a physical and metaphorical space that ungendered Black women in the Western sense through the removal of the Black female body from the space of the domestic. And C. Riley Snorton advances Spiller's theory of ungendered flesh to argue that the Middle Passage's ungendering of Black women manifested trans forms of resistance and captivity against captivity and fugitivity. In these trans forms of resistance, C. Riley Snorton characterizes how Harriet Tubman dressed as a man to lead other enslaved people to freedom, and how Harriet Jacobs dressed as a man as she was heading to the swamps to escape enslavement. And then additionally, Lucy Hicks Anderson, interestingly, was the first African-American indicted for dressing as a woman. He presents all these sort of examples of transfigurations of Black flesh. And I take these theories and explore how they function in relation to Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber to suggest that her text reflects the possibilities of Snorton's trans embodiment theory. Tantan, the protagonist of the novel, is ripped from a neo-colonial society and morphed into ungendered flesh. And as flesh, Tantan recrafts her identity through her acceptance of the dune and cultural memory. But I'll complicate this a bit in my paper. So Hopkinson constructs a neo-colonial society and ruptures Tantan's flesh, the protagonist of the novel, in a modern reimagining of the Middle Passage. Tantan is from Cockpit County, a township on the Toussaint planet. Hopkinson depicts the planet as a conglomeration of post-colonial societies. She emphasizes that Jonquinot season celebrates the arrival of the ancestors to the planet 2 centuries ago, and she describes the season as a time to remember the way their forefathers had toiled and sweated together. Tanuk Arab, Arawak, African, Asian, Indian, even the Euro, though some wasn't too happy to acknowledge their bloodline. All the bloods flowing into one river, making a new home on a new planet. Hopkinson's description of the planet conveys that Toussaint houses displaced transatlantic bodies, so seemingly an idealized society. Additionally, her naming of the planet is significant because Toussaint alludes to the Haitian leader Toussaint Louverture, who challenged French colonial rule. However, in the memoir of Toussaint Louverture, Philip Gerard indicates that after Toussaint was manumitted in 1776, he then acquired at least one slave and leased a dozen others from his son-in-law. Hopkinson's naming of the planet invokes the doubleness of Toussaint's identity. Though he was a Haitian leader for independence, he was also a slave owner. The doubleness of Toussaint's legacy marks Tantan's planet as a neo-colonial society. Cockpit County appears free, but it in fact remains entwined with colonialism. Granny Nanny, an artificial intelligence system, monitors and controls community members, the tools, the machines, the buildings, even the earth itself on Toussaint and all the nation worlds had been seeded with nanomites, Granny's hands and her body. The control Granny Nanny exerts on citizens parallels Western biopower's regulation and control of bodies through institutions and systems. Hence, Granny Nanny is a metaphor for the biopolitics of neocolonialism. While this society appears free and liberal, Granny Nanny monitors and controls the entire planet. And a wealth disparity exists between petty cab drivers and the majority. Thus, Toussaint is a neo-colonial society. So there's a major shift in the Black body leaving the Middle Passage and the Black body trying to exit neo-colonialism. In a modern re-envisioning of the Middle Passage, Tantan is ripped from her neo-colonial home and transformed into ungendered flesh on the prison planet New Halfway Tree. During Tantan's forced journey to New Halfway Tree, Hopkinson's language reifies the transatlantic Middle Passage. Tantan feels her body shift, and it was as though her belly was turning inside out, like wearing all her insides on the outside. And at the passage's final stage, she sobs for her family. The Middle Passage ripped Africans from their families and dislocated them throughout the Atlantic. But Antonio and Tantan enter the Middle Passage from a neo-colonial society. Therefore, Hopkinson's novel re-envisions the Middle Passage in a modern context. And this modernizing of the Middle Passage alludes to the modern post-racial rupture of Black flesh. Though race is now widely acknowledged as a social construction, at least in academia, this theory of constructivism destabilizes and delegitimizes contemporary Black identities. And Hopkinson's Middle Passage reflects this refleshification of modern transatlantic post-racial Black bodies. As flesh, Tantan is repeatedly raped by her father. Antonio's job as a neo-colonial governor suggests that his rape of Tantan functions as a metaphor for the generational trauma imbued in Black flesh during colonialism. It is worth noting that several diasporic male writers associate acts of colonial rape with the demise of women. In Richard Wright's Native Son, Bigger rapes and kills a Black woman. In Taib Seli's Season of Migration to the North, the anti-hero Mustafa Saeed rapes and kills a white woman. The rapes in these works end the female characters' lives. But in Hopkinson's narrative, the site of colonial rape, with rape referred to in this context as a metaphor for the dehumanizing and degrading acts of colonial terrorism on Black bodies, becomes a space for survival, agency, and reinvention. While Tantan's rape conveys the generational traumas of colonialism and neocolonialism, as Norton notes, it also creates a space for the rearticulation of Black female subjecthood. After the rape of her flesh, Tantan accepts the dune. Acceptance of the dune leads her to rearticulate her identity. But Tantan is not a guiltless character in this narrative. She is part of the institution of neo-colonialism. Therefore, Tantan's transformation begins with her own decolonization because she is complicit in the treatment of the dune as slaves. Her rearticulation manifests as her gaze acknowledges the other, the dune. On her 16th birthday, Tantan murders her father as he rapes her, and she subsequently escapes with Chichibud and Benta, his wife, to their dune home, the Papa Boy, the Daddy Tree. Upon her arrival to the dune's tree, Tantan's gaze cannot accept the differences the dune embody. She describes them as rat-bat things because she cannot perceive them beyond their physical appearances. Rez, the Daddy Tree elder, presents a tree fog to Tantan, but Tantan in this moment cannot process the cultural significance of this gift. She refuses to eat the tree fog without encouragement from Chichibud. The next day, when Tantan ventures from the Daddy Tree in search of food, she is unaware of her surroundings and loses track of the tree. However, when she becomes aware of her surroundings and learns to perceive the world through the other's eyes, she spies a leaf and realizes the Daddy Tree was wide as a village and she'd been under it all the time. On Toussaint, Tantan was dependent on Granny Nanny. But the dune, the indigenous population on New Halfway Tree, know how to survive without modern contraptions. They teach Tantan how to live in the bush, but she is only able to learn from them when her gaze recognizes them. In Tantan, Hopkinson creates a tension between the idea of progress as modernity and the idea of progress as an awareness of nature in others. Tantan progresses as she accepts the dune's cultural traditions. She develops agency. She learns how to survive. Tantan also rearticulates her ungendered flesh through an Afro-Caribbean cultural memory. In Chiggarbite Village, Tantan witnesses a mother violently whip her son. And as she witnesses this act, the memory of the midnight robber folktale resurfaces within her. Tantan grabs the belt from the mother and proceeds to whip her. Through her midnight robber memories of one of the most popular characters in the Caribbean Carnival festival, a character that typically is masculine and typically outsmarts opponents through wit, Tantan rearticulates herself as an avenger, and she begins to search out social wrongs to right. However, her quest to Chickerbite Town violate her acceptance of the Dunes' friendship. Tantan's heroic actions as the robber queen lead Janisette, her father's wife, to the daddy tree. For her violation of their friendship, the Dune expel her from their society. Though Tantan exposes the Dune, the survival skills she learns from them, accompanied with her midnight robber cultural memory, allow her to face the trauma of her pregnancy and rape. As Janisette confronts Tantan and Sweet Pone, Tantan voices her story in the entire village. The strength she gains from the memory of the Midnight Robber allows her to purge her trauma. As the novel ends, Tantan gives birth to a son and names him Tubman. Hopkinson's naming of Tantan's son invokes the power of cultural memory once again. With this naming, she challenges the notion of a post-racial existence. Tantan's strengths evolves from her cultural memory. Her roots repair her ruptured flesh. Though Tantan rearticulates her flesh through her acceptance of the Dune and her embodiment of the folkloric tale of the Midnight Robber, the narrative does not project hope for the Dune. Tantan's transformation into the Robber Queen manifests dire consequences for the Dune. In fact, her survival threatens their society's existence. Therefore, Hopkinson's reimagining of Black flesh embodies the complexity of the intersecting categories that surround identity. Race, gender, class, and imperialism impact constructions of identity, and Hopkinson's narrative implies that all constructions and rearticulations of Black flesh are susceptible to incorporating in enacting imperialism. Tantan's transformation suggests that rearticulated flesh can become pathogenic flesh. And I end with my last slide, which kind of takes it back to the idea of the thought experiment. Hopkinson's narrative leads us to consider how neocolonialism within the United States and on a global scale complicates Snorton's theory of Black transfigurations of the flesh. Even though Tantan transforms herself, her transformation impacts another marginalized community in a negative way. So it complicates the idea of these Black feminist theories. So there's an interesting dialogue that happens when we juxtapose Black feminist theories and thought against the genre of Afrofuturism. And then in the future, I'm interested in exploring the ways that the genre of Afrofuturism can further function as a proleptic thought experiment. So a future thought experiment for decolonial and Black feminist theories. Thank you.
Wonderful. And now we have Rejani.
Hi, everyone.
There she is. Okay.
It's so good to be here. I want to start with a quote, and it says, "What does it mean for Black women to create speculative visions of the world? And how do current Black women speculate, rewrite, revisit, and revision history in ways that connect them to Black women's legacies of struggle?" And this is a quote from Gwendolyn D. Pugh and Yolanda Hood, who wrote the article Speculative Black Women, Magic, Fantasy, and the Supernatural, which I used in my research as well. And so the title of my research is Bridging Speculative Fiction and Voice, Black Women Writers' Takes on Identity, Surrogacy, and Black Feminist Theory. And so with this research, I've analyzed how Black women writers of speculative fiction explore voice and identity through intersections of race and gender, surrogacy, and Black feminist theory. And I read and discuss the works of Black women writers within speculative fiction, such as N.K. Jemisin and Octavia Butler, as well as the transnational and transcultural authors Nydia Okorafor and Noelle Hopkinson, among others. And so these critical works, they really analyze possibilities of representation by reimagining characters to explore oppressive systems and challenge ideas surrounding difference. And their stories are more than literary works, but stories that theorize experiences of Black people, Black futures, and time. And so race and gender play powerful roles in how Black female experiences are expressed and how Black culture is presented in literary works. And so by examining ideas of racial and gendered surrogacy, I also have used Toni Morrison in this research, and she introduced a means of rereading scenes of encounter with differences portrayed in fiction. And I discovered correlations regarding motherhood and the creation of stories through fantasy. And Black women writers in this genre of speculative fiction are also commonly discussed within the realm of disability studies and redefining Black womanhood through the engagement of Black feminist theory. And as an extension of this, I incorporated creative writing as a research method to expand my work into the discussion of Black women writers within the genre and include my experience of writing a short story piece. And so some research questions that I included were, how does Black feminist theory challenge the ideas of otherness and how voice is imagined within these writers' works? How does voice shift and change within text? And what role does the use of fantasy as a surrogate play in discussing contemporary issues and experiences shape the notions surrounding Black futures? How do race and gender affect how people interpret and imagine speculative fiction works by Black women authors? And my objects of analysis were exploring the process of voice work and speech of Black women in the genre as part of challenging a much larger system. Diving into how exploration and speculation play a role, exploring how racial politics are involved, so the role of race and how the future is envisioned, examining the types of characters used and why, and analyzing the idea of surrogacy, not only in association with relationships or motherhood, but representing the creation of stories as a proxy for experiences through fantasy, and exploring the process of creative writing. And so I, again, use textual analysis and creative writing. I specifically used two texts to focus on, and those were Who Fears Death by Nnedi Okorafor and N.K. Jemisin's The Effluent Engine, which is a part of a collection of essays in their larger work, How Long Till Black Future Month. And so I really sought out authors and scholarship that encouraged and created movement toward more dialogue around these topics that I'm researching. And with creative writing, this is an art form that invokes experiences, imagine, and intrigue, and to understand creative writing as a process, having defined creative writing itself, that's helpful to explore the dimensions of what this could look like in a form that uses experience to discover the story a writer feels led to tell. And so with voice and identity, voice is a crucial aspect of what makes a person who they are, directs how or whether they are recognized by others, contributes to how people are being represented, not only in society, but literature as well. And so with Black feminist theory and race and gender, I specifically looked at the negative stereotypical images of Black women, and I used Patricia Hill Collins' Black feminist thought, knowledge, consciousness, and the politics of empowerment. And I specifically used their chapter, Mammies, Matriarchs, and Other Controlling Images. And this chapter highlights how the negative stereotypical images African American women have been portrayed as, such as the mammy, matriarchs, etc., have contributed to their oppression and a central focus of Black feminist thought. And these stereotypes and images of Black women have left them in a category serving as the quote unquote other. And to reject these images, Black women writers have created and written stories to encase their characters in other worlds, including Black women who redefine their realities, and the personal growth of these women and the inherent rejection of these images explores the themes of stereotyped images placed on Black women and the harm they do to our very existence. And so with the rejection of these images, stereotypes, and stigmas, and myths as well by Black women authors um, who are choosing to tell the stories of these women, I, I believe that's a form of reclamation and a way of controlling the narrative behind these images to redefine Black womanhood. And so with surrogacy and race and gender, I focused on Who Fears Death by Nydia Okorafor. And so there are many experiences that shape our identities that not only include us, but those who have birthed us, our mothers. And so Who Fears Death engages with rape as a form of violence to produce more violence, so giving birth to pain. And there's the mentioning of the 11th year rite tradition, which is the circumcision, a passage from child to adult, and signifies marriage and womanhood. And specifically with the central character, Anya Sanwu, she shapeshifts into not only a sparrow, but a vulture and many other animals, and only to feel there is something or someone she believes to be her biological father who's haunting her. And so with these racial factors that she experiences, there are also gender stereotypes present. She wants to learn more about these powers that she has and what are called the great mystic points, but a sorcerer, his name is Aro, refuses to teach her because she's female and of her Nuru blood. He tells her, you can't measure up, even in the gentler skills, and furthermore, you're filthy with woman blood as we speak. And so she's discriminated against because of her race and gender. And it's on a level that is infuriating, but I also focused on Goodbye to All That, Race, Surrogacy, and Farewell by Toni Morrison. And Morrison explores white America's idea of race, the surrogate relationships between Black and white women, and the idea of saying goodbye to art versus politics. So specifically the hindrance of race in literature. And her main argument is hinged upon Black women writers and artists not only being aware of the responsibility they have as writers to discuss race within their works, but also having the freedom to dive into areas of interest and create. And so Morrison brings forth the importance of how literature is read and imagined and the limitations of racial discourse, so specifically with surrogate relationships between Black and white women within works. And she also discusses the concept of surrogacy in the context of a relationship or motherhood. And for myself, I wondered, what if the idea of surrogacy was being portrayed in a different avenue by Black women writers? And so I argue that surrogacy can not only be an association with relationships or motherhood, but again, represent the creation of birth or the creation or birth of stories as a proxy for experiences through fantasy. And with Black futures, race, and relationship, I specifically center The Effluent Engine by N.K. Jemisin. And the center's on Jesseline Dumond. She's a Haitian spy, and she sets off to New Orleans and dives into a mission of helping her home country of Haiti. And so a passage from the text, if you build a methane extraction mechanism for us, mademoiselle, you will have helped a nation of free folks stay free, for I swear that France is hell-bent upon re-enslaving us all. And so this text captures actual moments of history, the Haitian Revolution, but deliberately calls out race, acknowledges the United States racial history, and highlights the violence that's happened. And so the use of historical truth, science, and fantasy brought the story to life in such an incredibly animated way. And Jemisin's choice to capture this sliver of history in the context of the Haitian Revolution, while paralleling this to America's racial roots, was really interesting to me. And with surrogacy, there's also another character, Eugenie, who is Creole, someone of European and African descent, among others. She's lighter in complexion and she's privileged. So while Jesseline is Haitian and darker in skin tone, I argue that the characters of Rejani and Jemisin and the relationship they have serves as a proxy to express their feelings for each other, which are barred by religious points of view. And in the text specifically, there's the example of nuns and Rejani being Christian. Jemisin depicts their relationship very openly and with adventure, and she kind of uniquely bursts a story of an experience that carries histories of the past and present while really catapulting readers into imagining the future. And so with future specifically, to understand Black women writers in this genre of speculative fiction, there has to be a grasp on how Black futures have been thought of in the past and present. And so often society thinks about Black people and their experiences through a perspective of the past and present, but rarely think about their futures. And from the stereotypical images imagined about our experience based on the color of our skin, the stigmas and myths associated with us have often become assumptions attached to our identities. And so I claim that Black women writers within this genre completely deconstruct these images and realities that have been imagined and push the boundaries of what is the quote unquote norm surrounding Black identities. And this coincides with Patricia Hill Collins' discussion with images of Black women. The narratives of our existence are being shifted and forcing readers to challenge their assumptions of Blackness, time, and familiarity. And so this genre creates new boundaries and parameters of change that challenge alienation and create further dialogue and conversations around history and Black futures. And so the writers that I've mentioned, they've taken these newly created boundaries and shifted the understanding of Black voices and futurity regarding time. And so with lastly, creative writing, I centered John Cook's essay, Creative Writing as a Research Method. And so sharing my thoughts as a new and emerging voice of my own through the creative process of a short story piece was very interesting. To understand creative writing as a process helped me explore a lot of different dimensions of what that could look like for myself and the work itself. So the short story title of, that I created is The Voice of Halon Chosen to Strike. And this follows a young woman named Logan who desires an escape from reality, but she quickly learns that this escape is calling her to a greater purpose of dealing with childhood trauma and saving the two worlds she is between. And so this process allowed me to draw from present and past experiences to allow me to imagine a space in the future where a woman can heal from deep-rooted pain. And this process has been a meditative journey of really surrendering my own expectations of writing and exploring possibilities of storytelling outside of my comfort zone as an emerging Black woman writer who is writing alongside fear as well within speculative fiction. And so to conclude, what connects the themes I've highlighted is the topic of identity that speaks to this larger theme of voice. And the topics I've researched largely, they really overlap and are very interwoven with each other. And so voice regarding Black women speculative fiction writers who take on identity and surrogacy and Black feminist theory, and the connections between themes seek to change narratives and interpretations of Black stories. And so engaging with these authors' works taught me that sharing my voice is very necessary. And so I want this to be part of a larger ongoing conversation that bridges voice and the discussion of the genre and help bring Black women writers of this genre to the forefront and show that there are Black women writers who are creating and reimagining worlds that challenge a larger system of oppression while creating stories that interlace histories, experiences, and people. These writers' stories matter in the past, present, and the future. And this is something I would love to continue researching and diving deeper into in the future. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you, Rejani. So Paul, let's hear from you.
Hey, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about N.K. Jemisin as well. I'm focusing on her Broken Earth trilogy, and I was going to read mainly from a paper that I've cut down and kind of worked around a little bit, and Rejani and Robyn have heard me kind of read this before, and a version of it at least. My bigger project deals with all kinds of speculation, but definitely Afrofuturism is a focus, and different groups of different types of science fiction. One of the things I think is really interesting is that, we have Afrofuturism, but indigenous futurism is kind of growing, and a lot of different models of understanding and forming arcs into the future. So I kind of just look at what N.K. Jemisin is doing to create a different arc of understanding lived reality, and also looking into how that lived reality is understood and can be shaped by the kind of speculative writing that she does. I think my argument touches on a wide range of theories, kind of like Robyn's. I feel like it builds and scaffolds a whole lot. And I think I'm finding more and more spatial and eco-critical theory falling into it. But I'll go ahead and start. So it's Old Man Earth Deforming the Anthropos, Democratizing Animacy, and N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy. The best speculative writing and then refamiliarizes the readers in a way that reorients their frames of reference and distorts naturalized configurations of natural and cultural processes. Recent recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, N.K. Jemisin has used her speculative writing to put tension on assumed notions of humanness. In Jemisin's Hugo Award-winning Broken Earth trilogy, as well as in her most recent book, The City We Became, which is really good if you haven't started yet, it's excellent. She reorganizes the human world correlate used by humans to relate to the planet, and in the understanding of how the planet relates to humans, in a process that first deforms the very idea of the human and the anthropos, and second refocuses her world building on the way the world literally builds humans. Jemisin's book centralizes the opposition between so-called natural powers and those that are built or man-made, and through literalization of the planet as a geological consciousness, she disrupts normalized notions of temporal and spatial scales. Distorting the typified anthropocentric frames of reference, Jemisin further breaks down hierarchies of animacy as to the understood relationship between humans and other things, as well as human groups with other human groups. Melly Chen in Animacy's Biopolitics, Racial Mattering, and Queer Effect delineates a lingual and practice hierarchy of animacy in which notions of humanness are staggered and normalized within dominant modes of westernized thinking to privilege first certain groups of persons that exhibit particular characteristics favored within that hierarchy, so that consequently specific types of humans are seen as more human than others. Such lingual abstractions lead directly to the kind of active inequalities and subjugations practiced throughout recorded human history, especially in imperialistic models of cultural expansion. Animacy hierarchies also play a larger part in explaining practices of enslavement and continuing institutions of role with systemic racism. Disability, race, ethnicity, gender, and religion are all factors that infiltrate speech itself, as well as other parts of day-to-day life in ways that suggest hierarchical levels of humanness. The aspects of the animacy hierarchy directly shape and are shaped by notions of what qualifies as a human or anthropos. And one of the most important aspects of the work that Jemisin confronts is how a reconfigured model of understanding reality can deform the animacy hierarchy and put tension on any kind of universalized understanding of what qualifies as the anthropos. Through that use of speculation, Jemisin highlights the manner in which practices of extraction and production of energy stores exacerbate what Michel Foucault calls biopolitics, and as an extension, what Akila Mbembe describes as necropolitics, to normalize a certain version of the anthropos, privileging certain human groups over others and reinforcing animacy hierarchies to the effect that certain beings are dehumanized as persons and instead utilized as collective assemblages to manage or actually be used as power sources. Additionally, these assemblages are made of either living or dead beings, oftentimes being worked, drained, or killed as a result of the end being sought. Embedded in such practices of extraction and production are designations of role and caste that propel particular traditions and political hierarchies within Jemisin's texts. Levels of agency coincide with such designations and lend to politically enforced systems of control and production. While Foucault's biopolitics suggests that such systems are concerned with functions of life, Mbembe's necropolitics delineates forms of biopolitics in which institutions go so far in applying biopower as to control who dies and how they do so, especially when this aligns with practices that help sustain existing power structures. The recent work of Dominic Boyer in defining a wholly different extension for Foucault's biopolitics that's focused on energy production can be applied to draw attention to how these components are at work in Jemisin's trilogy. Boyer, whose project comes from fieldwork he conducted in Mexico's Isthmus of Tehuantepec, describes his conception of the complex at work as energopolitics. In Boyer's model, energy and the impetus involved in its extraction, manufacture, and distribution works distinctly as part of a power composite that stands outside of other forms of political and cultural power. These energopolitics, while often working in tandem with the kind of political institutions that are found to be dominant in Foucault's biopolitics, can also exist independently of them and work with a different set of restrictions. If the idea of energy and its production, however, works in a manner consistent with the kind of model provided by Foucault with his biopolitics, then Jemisin's complication of these three notions can be especially productive in seeing both the forming and deforming of notions of the anthropos by human groups and of a type of reverse terraforming being done by the planet upon the anthropos, in which both existing human-driven power structures and institutions apply biopower and necropolitics in their processes, as the planet itself also uses various life forms as a source of biopower to achieve its own independent ends. The geological consciousness Jemisin worlds in her speculative texts inverts the power to shape or form from the human, transforming the natural environment to instead show the natural environment's morphing of the human, deconstructing the animacy scale independently from these dominant human power structures. The resulting set of relations in the novel pushed to a 40,000-year conclusion is to eventually create a more horizontal field of humanness, as well as a growing democratization within and beyond that to include the relations between humans and non-humans. What I argue then is that Jemisin's speculative worlding reorganizes an anthropocentric model of relating to reality with what I've called in other work a terracentric one where a geological consciousness produces, intentionally or unintentionally, transformations in sets of human-human relations, as well as human non-human relations. The transformations in Jemisin's world building force groups to choose how to reform and reorganize their comm systems, which is something that Jemisin has, in ways that discover certain potentialities in some members and create opportunities absent within the prior systems of governing. The Earth's cataclysmic geological and ecological seasons in the Broken Earth trilogy benefit the spontaneous adjustments and are uniquely able to reshape and force reshaping on the existing beings through necessitated adaptation evolution. It's a non-human influence then that forces an actual physical and cultural evolution of the humans. So I'm going to discuss a couple aspects of the book to help articulate how those changes are brought about in Jemisin's worlding. In the Broken Earth trilogy, much of the story is focused on a part magic, part science talent described as orogeny, the ability to harness forms of energy, heat, pressure, life, through being's will, directed through the sespene at the back of one's neck, and to channel such stores of energy to reshape geologies, manipulating tectonic plates that are constantly in movement, or to reach and pull energy into and out of the sky and even to reform matter itself. The orogeny ability is ostracized by most of the comms, and the fear as well as prejudice is so deeply embedded in the populations. The orogenes are killed outright as children or as their abilities are discovered. Regarding the flow of energy, of magic, of life force channeled, one key character who's named Alabaster, who's a powerful figure, who's first seen in the book is to rip a huge tear in the planet's surface, tells the trilogy's protagonist, Eason, that these energy and magic flows are the stuff of orogeny. And he explains that what people with this ability to do is to make the earth move by putting something of ourselves into the system and make completely unrelated things come out. Those who have this ability are called orogenes, and their ability or disability, as is seen by the other humans who are called stills in Jemisin's world building, can and is traced back in the trilogy to an ethnic group who populated a part of the world 40,000 years in the past. And I'll get to that group in a moment. Orogenes are distrusted by the massive human groups and are either killed out of fear upon being discovered were taken by so-called guardians to these fulcrums, which are city-sized camps where origins learn to refine, control, but also repress and suppress their abilities that are only to be used for the greater good of the civs left on the planet through quelling earthquakes and completing other geothermal maintenance tasks, which offers some protection to what remains of human societies in this type of indentured servitude where the origins accept their subservient position and trade for a general safety and being allowed to live. Jemisin gradually unveils several important insights about this world that illuminates the biopolitics, necropolitics, and andropolitics at work in the stillness. In addition to the stills, the origins, and guardians I've mentioned, there's the fourth group, a group most closely associated with humans who are called rock eaters, and whose backstory isn't revealed until the final book of the trilogy. The rock eaters are shown to be completely alien to the present human groups due to a material metamorphosis, a biological evolution enacted upon them by the earth, transforming them into a melding of life, rock, and magic. Even before the alteration took place, the rock eaters were seen as alien to what was then dominantly understood as the anthropos, or human. And I make this distinction to markate that this dominant group of humans' disregard for other beings as being human creates the primary tension that exists throughout the entire series. In the past time, the rock eaters were utilized as tools or tuners for the Plutonic engine made of giant living obelisks that could harness even greater stores of energy and magic. The rock eaters are genetically fabricated humans who are crafted from the genetic materials of the Nice, who was a population who had great connection and ability to manage and harness the life force of the planet, more so than any other human group. And it's this group that's the genetic ancestor for the origins, and the Silanagus civilization, whose dead civ ruins cover much of the world in the book's present. They were a technologically advanced society who's had these beautiful creations that contrast with these horrific methods that they used to reach those peak advancements. So after the Nice were conquered by the Silanagus, whose conquest seems directly aligned with their bias and prejudices towards them, the Nice are literally disconnected from their humanness in a way that dehumanizes the Silanagus almost as much. They're used like a battery or ignition point for the massive Plutonic engine, as raw magic must be used as a catalyst. To extract that raw magic, Silanagus creates what they call a briar patch, which obviously has some nice allusions to it. Lifelike thicket around the fragment's base, where the sink lines take all the magic of life from the Nice, save the bare trickle need to keep them alive. The rock eaters, unaware of what the briar patch was made of before taking a trip to see it, are repulsed to discover the fate of their genetic ancestors. This horrific scene, reminiscent of the kind of human farms in the Matrix, is shown to the rock eaters without concern, for the guy gal doesn't see what they're seeing, as if these stored componentized lives mean nothing to him. Notions and biases as to what constitutes the anthropos allow for a disconnect in seeing equal horizontal relationships between different groups of humans. And the same type of dehumanization of difference is done in the book's present by the fulcrum, whose strongest origins are seen as untamable and are put into a vegetative state and connected to a node network. This discounting of life that's different towards other humans mirrors the Silanagus' primary area in relating to the planet. The Silanagus simply see hierarchies among the different groups of humans beings and do not conceive of a hierarchical model of relations. They don't see things as horizontal, but always as vertical. The kind of control over life and death that the Silanagus muster here is reminiscent of Mbembe's discussion of necropolitics, and add to that the energy production centered in the harvesting of these people complicates Boyer's ideas of energopolitics. After all, what Jemisin connects horizontally here is the way life produces its own stores of energy that can be harvested and injected into organs or tools meant for control. But all this energy is connected through silver threads of life that weave through the geological parts of the planet, through the animal and vegetal life, through the human and human-like beings of the surface, and up into the spheres that take orbit in the heavens above. And a quote from the book: the stuff underneath orogeny, which is made by things that live or once lived, the silver deep within Father Earth wends between the mountainous fragments of a substance in exactly the same way that they twine among the cells of a living, breathing thing. And that's because a planet is a living, breathing thing. And we know this with certainty of instinct. All the stories about Father Earth being alive are real. The Earth itself, which is revealed in the novel to be an actual physical warfare with the humans, rock eaters, and origins on the planet's surface, even though most of them did not realize it, incorporates the dead into itself, harvests that energy into its ongoing attacks, creating the different seasons and the cataclysms that that shake the Earth and destroy all the civilizations as they develop. The Solangists had, back in the past, drilled into planet's core as they discovered the abundance of magic there and extracted a portion of the core from the planet. Eason's origin daughter, Nesin, as she rides an ancient physical vehicle that steers through that earthen core and feels the geologic conscious there, wonders about how these ancients who first ripped into the earth could have let that happen without recognizing the damage they would cause. She considers that it may never have occurred to them that so much magic, so much life, might be an indicator of awareness. And she thinks that perhaps these builders of the great obelisk network were not used to respecting lives different from their own. So dominant human groups have historically been unwilling to probe even the potential of a different reading of reality, but this immediate disqualification of even the possibility of such a reading relays the innate bias and privileging found in dominant modes of human perception. The same hierarchical bias initiates the conflict within the planet in Jemisin's novel that pushes the geological consciousness to work and rework its own surface and the life settle on it repeatedly through these fifth seasons until there's enough reconditioning and anthropoforming by the planet of these surface-dwelling humans to reorient their perception of social reality into a non-anthropocentered model, and one in which the hierarchies of what qualifies as human are also reconfigured in models like that of the novel's most democratic calm, Castrema, a calm that does not exclude the origins or even the rock eaters from their society, nor any being, no matter what or who they are. A notion, a model of anthropos that, it can be understood in closing the final book, still needs continual refinement. That's my close.
Wonderful. I love your close. So audience members, please go ahead and put questions in the Q&A. And I do have a comment here or a question for Rejani from Maya Gray. She says, have you read Angela Davis's work, Surrogates and Outcast Mothers, Racism and Reproductive Politics in the 90s? And she may have may want you to either know about that work or talk about that work if you do know it.
I actually have not read that work from Davis before, but that's one that I will keep on my radar and engage with in the future. So thank you, Maya, for recommending that to me.
I can start with some questions. I know there are probably folks in the audience who are more qualified than I am to speak to some of these things, but it seems to me that one of the things that's happening in Black speculative writing is you have some of these kind of empirical notions of identity, history itself, who is human, what the future represents, or who it is relevant to, that those are ideas that are being, if not subverted, then dispensed with, right? And I think that those are different approaches. One, subversion probably entails connection, right? Whereas dispensing with something and creating anew requires a different vocabulary and approach to the world. So, I think about this with all of your papers, right? The way that Robyn is talking about prolepsis, right? This kind of Black feminist thought, proleptic thought that is permitting a different kind of dialogue about Black feminism, right? And through different types of characters. I think about this with your work, Rejani, because you're talking about kind of the undoing of cultural memories and the what's the word? I can't think of the word, kind of reforming maybe of cultural memories, right? Or someone else will help me with a word. And then even, you know, as you're talking, Paul, and you're talking about sort of this kind of interplay between anthropomorphing and the natural environment, and kind of horizontal movements horizontal movements and vertical movements and all of that. So, and even the observation that you made that, you know, your works are scaffolding approaches, right? So those very narrow ideas that we usually, or far too often perhaps, still use in English literary studies, right? Narrow definitions of close reading and theoretical approaches and ways of envisioning the significance of a text, that those things can't really be used quite this way in approaching the works that you're looking at. So I wonder if I could get all three of you to, I know it's a murky question, but to respond to the kind of multivalent, experimental nature maybe of the fiction that you're interpreting.
For me, I think I'm sort of unconsciously coming to this place because it was really difficult to teach at a HBCU for 3 years and to watch students just feel burdened by a duty to remember history, to preserve it, because it's not written into a majority of sort of mainstream narratives. And also the tension between the older generation or even my parents' generation of the baby boomers. You know, I think of Gail Jones' Corregidor, and it's like, you will remember, you need to remember, you must carry this on. And that can kind of function in almost a stifling way. What do you do with it? How do you live with it? And I think of Rejani. I was at a presentation she gave, and it was about being in the wake, and you live in this sort of space that is not moving forward, and it can't move backward. And so I find, you know, the commitment that so many Black scholars put into writing Blackness into modernity, that it took a tremendous amount of labor that has kept scholarship from being able to think about the future. And I almost feel like there's an epistemology, a calling in Afrofuturism to move constructions of Blackness, to move ideas of race into the future. You will not remove our bodies from this space. And so for me, it's been also, you know, going through, you know, the difficult moments, it's been really nice to sort of feel like I can work to create some sense of change. And I think of Octavia Butler: anything you touch, you change; anything you change, changes you. That how can we do this? And it's sort of taking what we already have and pushing it forward, for me, has been really fruitful, but also revealing that we can't take everything with us. And Toni Morrison's idea of rememory and beloved, I almost feel like she left us with the questions to answer. Where will you go? How will you remember? And that's what I'm sort of grappling with.
That's so well said, Robyn. I think, like, for me, when I first started this research project, I came to Dr. Morrison and I was like, what if I did speculative fiction or like science fiction? I think I'd started with that. And I knew for a fact that I wanted to center Black women writers. And that was so important to me because for me personally, I wasn't really, as a child, exposed to a lot of Black women writers, especially in grade school. And so coming to college, that was something that was really pivotal and critical for me. It was engaging with these Black women writers, and, you know, to see Toni Morrison kind of coming into that conversation was something that kind of allowed me to leap into deeper waters with this topic, and to really take this conversation to a place where I can kind of go into new depths with Black feminist theory and the other topics that I researched. And so for me, I think it's a desire to know, for people to know that Black people's futures matter, and our narratives matter, and for these writers to actually contextualize our stories and our histories, our experiences, and these worlds is very profound. And I think something that really shifted for me was this past summer with Black Lives Matter and the police murderings of Black people. That was something that really allowed me to figure out my why for this. And so I think, along with Robyn, like that's something that I think pushes me to continue this research.
What I was gonna say, or what you guys are making me think about, because I feel like you just jump off with where you're talking, just kind of brought my thinking, is that I always look at Afrofuturism, and I've been teaching in high schools for 16 years, and I feel like in that time period, my goal as a teacher and what I teach and how I teach it has been to let people open up new doors, and to we talked about Toni Morrison and Octavia Butler, and the idea of kind of bringing speculation into history and kind of rewriting history, but in order to open up new ways of looking into the future, right? To approach it differently, and being able to step into those doorways in ways that that are relevant and give agency. And I think it's I think it has, like, that speculative work has to be done in order to make real life changes occur or seem possible, right? Like, you're creating possibilities in a lot of ways.
Even in your presentation, Paul, when you were talking about how Jemisin sort of characterizes the earth as sort of personifies the earth as a character. I mean, that shift in thinking can be sort of really valuable in terms of, like, it's almost sort of a knowledge shift that I cannot remove humanness from aspects, or we're creating sort of binaries and boundaries between humanness and these other shapes. And what happens if I sort of have to readjust my thinking. I really enjoyed that part of your presentation. It pushed me to sort of think through nature in a different way. I think you've made some nice changes too.
Beautiful. And we have another question from Marlis. Marlis says, Rejani, I loved your presentation. Do you consider fiction within the fantasy genre, particularly high fantasy, is capable of the same notions you explore in your research?
Thank you so much, Marlis. I do think so, that fantasy or high fantasy could play a role in this. I have considered that, and with speculative fiction itself, like, it's more of like an umbrella term in a sense. So yes, definitely I will center fantasy and high fantasy in the future to kind of integrate into my research. So,
Which I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting to talk about, because I feel like science fiction has spent so long being kind of outcast by, like, the literary world and considered, more juvenile or something like that. But I feel like fantasy, like science fiction, I feel like has broached it somehow. I feel like fantasy hasn't quite taken that step yet, is what I like about Jemisin, because I think she does a good melding of fantasy and science fiction. But it's just interesting that, like, fantasy itself, I think, is still the child we need to invite into the room.
Funny.
I have one question for Robyn, which I was just going to ask you, Robyn. when you Tubman having Granny Nanny like inside, what do you make of that at the end of Midnight Robber with all of the kind of conversation you had about flesh and bodies and all that? I was curious since it's
You mean the turn at the end to sort of where she has the child and then she names the child Tubman, and it's kind of just that ending, and you don't really kind of know where it's the text is going to go. I struggle with I'm hoping to sort of explore the relationship that some African futurist and sort of Black feminist Afrofuturist writers have with the criticism itself. Like I get the instinct that they know what we're reading, and that they could kind of that they are really part of the conversation, the theoretical conversation. And in ways I sort of make of it the ending in the name of Tubman as sort of like it's not written what will be written. There's this instinct that perhaps her child will repeat the same legacy, will perhaps harm another community in trying to seek liberation, but that also um, the knowledge that perhaps Tantana has gained will write a different future for her child. But it's interesting that it's sort of left open because perhaps it isn't sort of written.
Well, and I was just curious because Granny Nanny, because when you were talking about Granny Nanny, I kind of saw it as this kind of colonizing presence, right, of the artificial intelligence is kind of running the thing. And it's the interesting thing when Tantan goes over, right, like she brings Granny Nanny with her, and then it's embedded like organically into Tubman. And I was just like, what does that mean? And is it
because I kind of center it as neo-colonialism, so that's interesting. That is there a way that the technology, when it becomes sort of biocentric, is there a sort of a change there? That's really interesting.
Yeah. It's just something I was thinking about.
I don't know, but I like the idea, and I definitely want to play with it. Thank you.
So I have two questions since our attendees are being shy, even though they know more than I do. So I have two questions. One has to do with the depiction of race or Black suffering, right? And wondering whether that is a necessary component of the kinds of literature you're reading, and if so, how what is it attempting to do? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I would say with Jemisin, what I found, because I think Hopkinson would be a little different with what I've read from Hopkinson. And what I've seen in Jemisin is she tends to take the suffering of many different marginalized human groups and kind of puts out there as opposed to specific, categories of it. At least that's something I've noticed with her, which I find very interesting, that she kind of, and part of it, I think in Broken Earth Trilogy especially, is it's such a different framework of a world that's built there. But I think she also wants to explore that these biases and prejudices are not like delineated by certain characteristics, but by the fact that we force these labels and force these characteristics and imagine, things that aren't necessarily there at all, in order to subjugate others. So I think that that's important to show that humans tend to subjugate others and to inflict pain on others. I don't know. I think it depends on what approach the authors are taking. I do think that some do focus a lot on, but I think Jemisin is interesting that she kind of builds out a bigger picture of general human nature.
For Hopkinson, at least in Midnight Robber, I think it functions as the site of transformation. The suffering is sort of the catalyst for transfiguration, in the same way that I think Hortense Spillers is saying, you know, the middle passage, it's a fleshification process, a process of and sort of moving a way of living through that and way of surviving the suffering that that initiated, is through taking sort of these different figurations. And then I think Hopkins sort of comes in there and complicates it and says, but you can't just morph into, you know, outside of these systems. And so it leads us to think that what do you do with that sort of Black suffering? It leads me back to sort of Morrison, and how do you keep it and move forward? How do you remember and release? And I think part of it is I'm seeing a trend of sort of restorative histories, when the Midnight Robber is this sort of Caribbean folk tale of the carnival, which is like this one positive thing, that like this creation of space, and that like moving from sort of that folklore and using sort of the storytelling in sort of, I will write my way out, I will preserve, focus on aspects of beauty that came from sort of the suffering. And that the Midnight Robber, I mean, it's such a major carnival character. It's also been appropriated. If you watch, Keira Knightley has this new show, and it is obviously a take on the Midnight Robber and extracted for a white female character. But the moving the suffering and how to kind of manipulate it for survival in positive ways is sort of a space that I find fascinating, that it's sort of pushing for, but it's still a really, really difficult narratives. The narratives of suffering really, really remain difficult to carry. And so maybe restorative histories is a way to teach them and not cause pain.
Nice. Rejani, did you want to say something?
Yes, I think that like with the two texts that I centered in my research, N.K. Jemisin's The Effluent Engine, and Who Fears Death with Nedia Corfor, The Effluent Engine with, you know, the Haitian Revolution, and, you know, wanting to, Jesseline wanting to help her people, and, you know, the suffering and pain that was a part of that. And Nedia Corfor, who, with Who Fears Death, the story kind of centers this conflict between two groups, and one thinking they're superior, and there's a lot of suffering and death within that. And even in the like the story I created, I, you know, I focused on trauma as well, but I think that something that's really critical is the ability to not make that all of what a character or the narrative is. And I think with a core force specifically, like she takes Anya Sonru, and, you know, she's like, yes, this, and this, you know, is a part of her, you know, her story, her narrative, but that's not all of who she is. She's this very powerful figure. And, you know, that's something that she's used to kind of like influence the decisions she makes, but ultimately she's rejecting them. So I think that space of, you know, pain and suffering within literature, I think it's very complicated to kind of include that, but also like move away from that. So.
Well, I think that's really helpful. And I feel like we've only just started the conversation, but we have to say goodbye for now. I want to thank our panelists, Robyn Luney, Rejani King, and Paul Piedkowski. And I'd also like to thank Ms. Kalia Carter, the program coordinator, who is with us on this meeting and is just invaluable in terms of what she's bringing to the CACE conference. I want to welcome you to come to our next panel, which is from 2 to 3:15 p.m. It is titled Afro-Latina Activism, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, and Beyond. It is in Spanish and Portuguese, just so you know. But we do have panels following that one that will be in English and on related topics. We have a panel at 3:30, Afro-Peruvians from Colonial Times to the Present, which will be in English, and a closing roundtable in English on the role of Black women in Latin American and Caribbean history and letters since the 18th century. Pretty robust there in terms of scope. Thank you all so much. I look forward to future conversations, speaking of our way of carving out a future, to talk about these texts. Take good care, everyone.